The file begins. April 2026. The news of Sean Combs' successful appeal hits the wire not like a thunderclap, but like a change in barometric pressure. The kind that makes old wounds ache. In a sterile Calabasas home, surrounded by the quiet hum of air filtration, the pop idol feels the phantom limb of his past begin to twitch. This is the anatomy of a haunting. The $200 million from his catalog sale suddenly feels less like a retirement fund and more like bail money paid in advance. His phone vibrates with encrypted messages from his legal team. Cold, precise sentences advising public silence. Advising distance. But distance is a luxury he no longer possesses. The curse of proximity, once a golden ticket, is now a debtor's prison. Every photograph of him as a teenager, smiling beside the mogul, is now an exhibit in the court of public opinion. A ghost from a party that never ended. He made a choice back then, a single fatal mistake buried under a decade of hits and headlines. Now the ground is starting to give way. To understand the collapse, we must rewind the tape to 2025, the year of the supposed reinvention. The album's Swag and Swag 2 were not creative breakthroughs. They were exorcisms, a frantic attempt to drown out a rising frequency of fear with sheer volume. The public saw an artist reclaiming his narrative. The file shows a man building a fortress of noise. His open call for collaborators on social media was not an invitation. It was a desperate search for bodies to fill the empty rooms of his life. News footage from that year shows the cracks. The vacant stares during interviews. The erratic energy in staged paparazzi shots. Social media comment sections became a digital inventory of his decay. First came concern, then mockery, then pause. The whispers began. Old photos resurfaced. Timelines were scrutinized. The public, with its bottomless appetite for tragedy, started connecting dots he had spent years trying to erase. The fatal mistake wasn't made in 2025. It was merely the year the bill came due. To understand the debt, one must first audit the original transaction. The year is 2009. The asset is a boy with a guitar and a YouTube account. His talent was the bait. His youth was the hook. The world didn't consume a musician. It consumed an archetype of innocence so pure it had to be manufactured. The haircut, the purple hoodie, the squeaky clean lyrics about a first crush. It was a cultural communion wafer, and the masses were starving. They built an empire on that boy's high-pitched voice, a fortress of global adoration. But the screams of 10,000 fans sound exactly like the silence of a prison cell when you're the only one inside. Every handler, every agent, every adult in the room saw not a child, but a unicorn. A once-in-a-generation phenomenon to be monetized before it learned to speak the word no. The anatomy of this fall began here, not with a crime or a scandal, but with a signature on a contract a boy couldn't possibly comprehend. The first nail in a very small coffin. This machine required operators, men who understood how to turn potential into profit and innocence into a much darker currency. Enter Sean Combs. The file doesn't list him as a mentor. It lists him as an acquisition specialist. Their early encounters were not the passing of a torch. They were a transfer of ownership. Combs' world was a velvet-lined trap, smelling of expensive cologne and unspoken agreements. He didn't offer the boy guidance. He offered him a glimpse into the next level of the game, a world where fame was not a consequence of art, but the only art that mattered. The power dynamic was established from the first handshake. The king and the pawn. The veteran and the commodity. Then came the now infamous decree, delivered with the casual authority of an emperor. Justin would be handed over for 48 hours. Pause. It was presented as a trial, a boot camp for stardom, but the archival record shows it for what it was. A branding, a claim. The clock didn't just start a mentorship, it started a different, more sinister countdown. That countdown didn't end with an explosion. It ended with a bill. The first invoice arrived not in an envelope, but as a legal summons, a ghost from a past he thought was buried under layers of platinum records and public prayers. The Combs affair did not create these allegations. It merely provided the key to the archive where they were stored. The inventory of sins began. A lawsuit, previously dismissed as youthful indiscretion, was refiled. The plaintiff's name is less important than the accusation's architecture, alleging a pattern learned during those formative 48 hours. His past was not a memory, it was a creditor. And with the Combs empire crumbling, all associated debts were being called in. Pause. The charge wasn't just about an act, it was about a curriculum. The legal documents paint a portrait of a protege, not just in music, but in a specific brand of silent predation. This was the first tremor, the first crack in the foundation of the new, reformed Bieber. A fatal mistake, long dormant, now had a case number. The case rested on more than just memory. It rested on digital ghosts. Investigators for the Combs trial, in their forensic audit of his collapsed empire, unearthed a server. A digital tomb containing years of communications, thought to be deleted. In that tomb, a folder. The folder's name was simple. Pause. The Skylark Project. Inside were not songs but encrypted messages, travel itineraries and payment receipts linking back to Bieber's early entourage. One specific file, a deposition from a former bodyguard previously bound by a non-disclosure agreement, became the cornerstone. He didn't speak of parties. He spoke of logistics, of being instructed to clear a hotel floor, of special guests who never appeared on any public schedule. His testimony was a cold, procedural account of how innocence was managed, isolated, and then processed. This wasn't a smoking gun. It was the blueprint for the entire arsenal. The past was no longer a story. It was admissible evidence. The past was no longer a story. It was admissible evidence. Bieber's defense strategy was an exercise in sentimental archaeology. They presented him not as a man, but as a relic of a corrupted era, a child puppet whose strings were pulled by Paul Scooterbraun and Pa's Sean Combs. His lawyers painted a portrait of a boy trapped in a gilded cage, too young to comprehend the machinery of sin operating around him. The prosecution dismantled this narrative with cold, fiscal precision. Their argument was simple. The Skylark Project didn't end when Bieber turned 18. It evolved. They produced financial records showing payments from Bieber's newer corporate entities into accounts linked with the project's logistics network. Payments made as recently as 2023. The key testimony came from a sound engineer from the Swag Sessions. He spoke of a different Justin, not the penitent husband, but a man obsessed with control. A man who referred to his early career not with regret, but with a chilling phrase. Pause. A necessary investment. The strain began to show. The Skylark brand launch was indefinitely postponed. His public appearances ceased. He became a ghost in his own multi-million-dollar life. the concrete walls of his mansion turning into a pre-trial bunker. The Combs verdict landed not like a gavel, but like a demolition ball. It wasn't just a legal precedent, it was a cultural verdict on an entire generation of power. The guilty sentence for Combs established a new, brutal calculus for the public and the justice system. Proximity to the crime was now indistinguishable from participation. This was the domino effect in its purest form. Pause. Bieber's carefully curated 2025 comeback, his narrative of fatherhood and redemption with the swag albums, evaporated overnight. It was now seen as a desperate smokescreen, a cynical rebranding attempt before the inevitable reckoning. Media outlets that once celebrated his return now ran side-by-side timelines of his career and Combs's confirmed crimes. The mentorship was recontextualized as indoctrination, the collaborations as complicity. The headlining slot at Coachella was quietly rescinded. Pause citing scheduling conflicts. The anatomy of his fall was now public spectacle. The Diddy verdict provided the blueprint, and the world began to see the same patterns in the crumbling architecture of Pause Bieber's empire. His legacy was no longer his music, it was his association. It was his association. The year 2026, once slated for a coronation, became a siege. The Calabasas estate transformed from a home into a high-security bunker, a gilded cage where the only visitors were lawyers and the only sound from the outside world was the persistent, vulture-like whine of paparazzi drones. Privacy was not merely lost. Pause, it was surgically removed. The birth of his son, Pause Jack Blues, was no longer a personal joy, but a data point in a public tragedy, a child born into a kingdom under audit. His new clothing line, Skylark, became an instant punchline. Its slogan, "Take Flight," was now morbidly ironic. He retreated. The digital ghost who once craved connection now found himself in a self-imposed exile, surrounded by acres of manicured lawn and an ocean of silence. This was not the loneliness of an empty stage. This was the profound solitude of a man watching his own legacy be buried alive from the inside of his own mausoleum. The silence from the bunker was finally broken, not with a confession, but with a press release. A carefully constructed wall of text posted to Instagram, engineered by a crisis management team charging $10,000 an hour. It was a masterclass in saying nothing. The statement spoke of challenging times and mischaracterizations. It affirmed his commitment to faith and family. It was polished concrete, smooth, gray, and offering no purchase for a public hungry for contrition. Each word was a digital sandbag placed against a rising tide of evidence. But the tide did not recede. The public performed its own post-mortem audit, a posthumous audit on a career still twitching. They juxtaposed his sanitized corporate speak with old interview clips, with photos of him and Pause Combs on yachts, their smiles suddenly looking predatory. The denial's fatal flaw wasn't a lie, it was its sincerity, a sincere belief that his pain was the central tragedy of the story. This belief was his most expensive asset, a delusion purchased for $200 million. The sale of his music catalog wasn't a business decision, it was an exorcism, a failed attempt to buy back his own soul by selling its recorded history. The money arrived, a tidal wave of digital zeros meant to wash away the sins of the past. But it only fertilized the void. From this void grew Skylark, a clothing brand, another skin to shed. He wrapped his new identity in luxury fabrics, hoping the world wouldn't notice the tremors underneath. The birth of his son, Pause Jack Blues, was not a salvation. It was the introduction of a perfect, fragile mirror into a house of horrors, reflecting back everything he feared he was. The anatomy of his fall was now complete. He had achieved the ultimate poverty. The poverty of a man who has everything and feels nothing. He was a king reigning over an empire of ash, mistaking the glitter for Pause gold. The psychic breakdown of 2025 was not televised. It was released. The albums Swag and Swag 2 were not comeback records. They were field notes from a padded cell. A digital coffin containing the raw, unprocessed data of a system collapse. Mumbled confessions over dissonant beats. Less polished, the critics said. They meant less hidden. The Instagram post begging for collaborators in Los Angeles was the key. Here was a man who could summon any artist on the planet with a single phone call, reduced to sending a message in a bottle into the digital ocean. A former sound engineer later recalled, anonymously, he wasn't writing songs. He was just recording the sound of the ghosts in his head. The announcement of his Coachella headlining slot was not a triumph. It was a sentence. He was being marched from the isolation of his gilded bunker onto the world's biggest stage. A final, public stress test for a structure already riddled with pause fractures. The public autopsy began. The shift was not from love to hate. It was from adoration to morbid curiosity. Believers didn't abandon the faith. They simply became rubberneckers at the scene of a spectacular crash. The new brand Skylark was not a fashion statement. It was a shroud hastily thrown over the decaying corpse of the Purpose era. His personal relationships underwent a similar audit. Haley was no longer just a wife. She was the chief conservator of a crumbling monument. Her public stoicism, a masterclass in damage control. The sale of his music catalog for $200 million was the final act of self-dissection. He sold his past. He liquidated his own ghost for cash. This wasn't a business deal. It was the ultimate admission that the original artifact was now considered worthless to its creator. The scandal wasn't a single act. The scandal was the truth he started telling in his music. A truth so raw and unpalatable, it fractured the very foundation of the idol they thought they knew. This is the anatomy of exile. The inner circle did not react. It evaporated. The departure of Scooter Braun wasn't a professional parting. It was an amputation performed without anesthetic, a final, brutal severance from the machine that built him. The financial settlement was just the cost of burying the evidence. His call for collaborators on Instagram was the flare shot up from a lifeboat, a confirmation that the bridge was empty. The old guard had either fled the plague ship or were locked out of the captain's quarters. Family became the final retreat, the 10 bunkera. The birth of his son, Jack Blues, was not a celebration of new life. It was the installation of a new fragile security system in a fortress under siege. A human anchor. A reason to keep the doors locked. The silence from former friends and allies was the verdict. They were not complicit or supportive. They were pause gone. In the wreckage of his empire, Justin Bieber found himself utterly and professionally alone. This isolation was not an accident. It was a feature baked into the source code of his stardom. He was the last great child soldier of the Diddy era, a time when talent was a commodity and youth was the currency. An entire generation of executives saw children not as artists, but as assets, to be leveraged, to be mortgaged, to be bled dry. His story is not his own. It is the ghost story, told to frighten new talent, a cautionary tale written in the ink of non-disclosure agreements. The industry didn't just sell his music, it sold his adolescence piece by piece, on magazine covers and in TMZ clips. An anatomy of a public vivisection. The contract stipulated that the public would own his triumphs, and more importantly, they would own his pause collapse. Justin Bieber wasn't a victim of his own mistakes. He was the intended result of a successful business model. And every business model produces waste. In the empire of celebrity, the waste is toxic. It takes the form of litigation. The $200 million sale of his catalog was not a victory lap. It was the frantic liquidation of assets before the auditors arrived, a desperate attempt to cash out of a burning building. The lawsuits now circling his name are not about specific transgressions. They are a besmirtany audit of an entire era. Each filing is a shovel digging into the foundations of his carefully constructed narrative. The money is a shield, but it is a thin one. The truth has a different weight. This is not about financial ruin. This is about the final, irreversible staining of the brand. The name Bieber risked becoming synonymous not with pop music, but with a culture of complicity. The depositions, the discovery, the sealed documents, they are not just legal procedures. They are the slow, methodical assembly of his pause, Cifravoy grub. The courts will deliver their verdict, but the court of public memory has already begun its deliberation, and its judgment promises to be far more severe. The media that built the Boy King now feasts on his corpse. This is the final stage of the symbiosis. The headlines are not journalism. They are an inventory of sins for a paying audience. Each click, each share, is a nail driven by an unseen hand. The tabloids, once content with documenting his haircuts, now operate with the precision of forensic accountants, tracing the lineage of every rumor back to a single fatal character flaw. They created the curse narrative because curses sell better than complications. It transforms a human tragedy into a consumable ghost story. Social media is the accelerant. A digital mob armed with looped gifs of his youthful arrogance and screenshots of old forgotten posts. They are not seeking truth. They are conducting a public exorcism. Every reshared article, every vicious comment is a prayer for his downfall. This is the true meat grinder of fame. It doesn't just chew you up. It packages the remains for mass consumption. The story is no longer his. It belongs to the algorithm, which has judged it, found it profitable, and sentenced it to pause eternal circulation. The verdict of the courts is a footnote. The real sentence is being served in the present tense, in a gilded cage of his own making. Two paths remain on this map of a ruined territory. The first leads to silence, a complete digital and public erasure. To become a ghost, haunting a Calabasas mansion, a whispered legend of what happens when a star falls too fast. This is the path of the forgotten, a self-imposed exile. It is an admission that the brand is toxic, the name unsalvageable. The second path is more complex, more cynical. It is the path of manufactured redemption. A tearful interview, a carefully chosen charity. A new album, not a pop, but of penance. This requires him to perform the greatest role of his life, the man who found his way back. But can a man whose every move has been monetized ever perform an act of genuine contrition? Or is it just another product launch? This is the critical juncture. The fatal error from which there is no recovery, only management. His fate is not yet written in stone, but it is deeply, perhaps irrevocably, mangled. The final question is not whether he can find his way back to the light. The question is whether he can convince the world and himself that the man standing in it isn't just a paw's hollow echo. An echo that now competes with a much louder sound, the deafening crack of a legacy fracturing in two. Before the shadow fell, the inventory of his life was simple: record-breaking sales, a global religion built on a haircut and a falsetto, the boy who had everything. His name was a synonym for a specific, manufactured strain of teenage hysteria. That was the brand. Pause. That was the asset. The post-scandal ledger tells a different story. The name Bieber is no longer a headline. It's a footnote in someone else's indictment. His attempts at reinvention, the introspective album titled, with tragic irony, Swag, the headlining slot at a festival that now feels more like a wake, are not acts of artistry. They are damage control. He sold his past, his entire music catalog, for $200 million, a preemptive cash out before the stock became worthless. He had a son, Jack Blues Bieber, the name itself a confession. It's a desperate construction of a new narrative, the family man, the survivor. But the stench of those parties is a permanent stain. The final audit will ask one question: what will be remembered first? The chorus to Baby, or the silence that followed the accusations? This is the anatomy of the fall. Not just of one boy, but of the entire system that feeds on disposable youth. Bieber was never a person. He was a project, a product assembled by men like Braun and polished by men whose names are now sealed in court documents. His fate is the logical conclusion of the meat grinder of fame, an industry that prizes profit over personhood. The lesson here is not about a single pop star's poor choices. It is a post-mortem audit of the machinery itself, the network of lawyers, publicists, and executives who build the golden cage and then sell tickets to watch the occupant slowly go mad. They are the architects of this particular ruin. Accountability in this world is a mirage. It's a settlement, a non-disclosure agreement, a carefully worded press release. Justice is for the powerless. For the powerful, there is only reputation management. Justin Bieber's story is the ultimate case study. A cautionary tale written in bank deposits and sealed depositions. He is the ghost in the machine, a walking, talking piece of evidence that the price of a ticket to the top of the world is always, eventually, your own soul. The legacy is not the music, it is the warning.